We spooky gang, what is going on? Welcome back to Tarot Tech. It is your boy Tech, and I just hope y'all having a beautiful day, a blessed day. We back with another one of them bangers. So y'all already know how we rocking. But hey, so we are back with our traverse through all the decades of horror. We've already done the 70s, and now we're on to my favorite decade, which will be the 80s. Now, before we start diving into the video, all the spooky gang, a big shout out and a thanks to all you guys. We are now over 500 subs. The channel is growing so quickly, and I just can't express to you guys enough how much I appreciate it. I just love interacting with you guys, seeing all the comments. So it's just amazing to see that sub count going up. Hey, we still on that road to 1K subs. So if you haven't already, go ahead, subscribe to the kid. Nothing but horror bangers coming y'all way. So y'all go ahead, subscribe to the kid, like the video, and shoot, I ain't gonna hold this video up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So the 1980s, what a beautiful decade. It's a decade full of nostalgia, and really it's nostalgia that I didn't even experience because I was born in the 90s, but still just nostalgia just because everything just seems like it was so fire back then. Great music, you think of a lot of vibrancy, and it was the birth of slashers as we know them today. Now, of course, with the 80s being littered with a million slashers, this whole list discussion and analysis isn't going to be solely geared around slashers, but we're going to have other subgenres and stuff like that in the mix because some of those other subgenres have a lot of prominent movies as well. So the cool thing about it to me is the difference that we get between the 70s and the 80s. You know, with the 70s, you're coming off more of like you're mainly focused on psychological type horror, you know, and a level of realism. Whereas when you move into the 80s, yes, the rise of the slasher, and you have better effects overall. You have more gore, more kills, better kills, and this is also the decade where a lot of horror movies became horror franchises. So, you know, all of our favorites, the Halloweens, the Friday the 13th, the Texas Chainsaws, the Nightmares, you know, all of those movies, that's where they became franchises, and I'll say dang near the majority of them have at least 5 to 6, 7 movies, all just within that decade. But the thing that was a damper on the 80s is the MPAA. Around that time, like in the early 80s, like especially coming off of like all the blood and all the effects that we got in like a movie like the first Friday the 13th, so many movies that came after that were killed by the MPAA. So, and for the people who are not familiar with the MPAA, they essentially are and were in charge of, you know, controlling how much you see in terms of, you know, blood and gore and nudity and sex and all of those different aspects. They're really in control of that. And so even for a lot of these movies being R-rated, like the MPAA progressively got worse. So by the time you hit the mid to late 80s, then, you know, a lot of these movies where it could have had some of the most creative kills that you would have ever seen, but a part of it is cut out. So maybe you only see, you know, blood squirting out of, you know, blood coming from somebody's throat for, you know, a second, as opposed to, you know, a 2-3 second real run of just all of it gushing down and things of that nature. So they did really put a little damper on things, but we still got some mean bangers out of it. So with that being said, diving into 1980, we got some true bangers that kicked off the decade. We're thinking about movies like Friday the 13th, like I've mentioned already, in 1980. That was the original, and that's the birth of one of the most famous horror icons, Jason Voorhees. He wasn't a major figure in that movie, but still, Friday the 13th is a really good movie, really great movie, and it was a great way to start the franchise. And then you have a Prom Night starring Jamie Lee Curtis. Really, honestly, it was almost a Jamie Lee Curtis show in like between 1978 and 1980, her and Halloween. Then you have her in Prom Night. Then another movie that she's in that I wanted to mention is The Fog. And, you know, that's also Carpenter. So you see the relationship between them two. So the best of that year, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Amazing movie. Everybody knows Jack Torrance and, you know, the Overlook Hotel and everything that entails. Really great movie, and for anybody who has not seen that, you're really slacking. It's one of the best horror movies of all time, so that's dang near a must watch. So then as you roll into 1981, then you start to get more of the sequels of those same slashers that we talked about before. So you have a movie like Halloween 2, where you're coming off the success of Halloween from 78, but A couple of the differences is you definitely get a little more slasher element. So you have more kills overall in this movie. For the people who are big into TNA, more of that. So many different aspects, more of a slasher element of what we loved from the 78 version. Then you have Friday the 13th Part 2, where now you really have Jason as a prominent figure in the movie. That's also really good. One of the best set of characters in all of the Friday the 13th, having Jenny, Paul, and all the rest of the crew that was there. You have a movie like Evil Dead. Evil Dead makes its debut, and that was a really good movie and was different from a lot of the other type of zombie horror that we had seen before. Also a movie that I watched for the first time just a few years ago, American Werewolf in London. That's another prime example of what I talked about in terms of really where the horror industry really was starting to get better at those effects, because some of those effects that you get to see, especially those transitions as he turns it into a wolf and comes back from it, I'm not 100% sure if it was all practical, but just know that it looked very, very, very good in my opinion. So American Werewolf in London, also a banger movie for 81. Then we transition into 1982. We have George Romero's Creepshow. Not my favorite of the creep shows, and I'll dive a little deeper into that and why. An amazing movie from Romero. We all know him from, Night of the Living Dead and all of the Dead movies. So for him to come back with a creep show, and what makes Creepshow special is it's an anthology movie. So there were some horror franchises that wanted to turn their franchise into an anthology series, meaning each movie in the franchise is not related pretty much in any aspect to the other. So they're completely different stories, but they're all in the same franchise. Well, this movie sort of does that all within a movie. So it's like 3 to 4 stories within the movie, but then there's like a central story that sort of ties all the rest of the individual stories together into making one movie. So it's pretty interesting, really cool concept. So that was good. And you have movies like Poltergeist and Friday the 13th Part 3, which pretty much is my favorite of the Friday the 13th. Not because he got his mask or anything like that, even though it is a really iconic look, but overall I think I like the cast a little bit better of Friday the 13th Part 3. Jason seemed a little more brutal in Part 3 and all that good stuff. So 82, can't beat it. Banger movies. Then we roll into 1983 and we start off strong with a movie like Sleepaway Camp. Everybody knows that I have an affinity for Sleepaway Camp, not just the first one, but the second one and the third one, and those are also some that I might get into a little bit later as we go through the decade. But really great movie. Felissa Rose, can't beat her. She just does her role so well, and considering she was so young when she did it. Movies like Christine, also a Carpenter movie. And Christine is actually really good. It's interesting to have basically a car be the main villain of the movie, but the way that Carpenter goes about it and tells that story. And then that also leads me into a movie like Cujo, which, together when we think about this is also like Stephen King's decade as well. So a lot of his most famous, novels and things of that nature, a lot of those movie adaptations came out in the 80s and the 90s of his books. And then rolling into 1984, the Nightmare on Elm Street, the original. And that, I've been on record, that is probably the most creative concept for a horror movie ever. Just to think that, when you're most vulnerable, which is when you're sleeping, that's actually when he decides to get you. And then he gets you in your dreams. Everybody has to sleep. Everybody is gonna have dreams, whether you remember them or not. So that's just that concept alone made for a fantastic, without me even mentioning Robert Englund as Freddy. We all know the icon that he is, so we don't even have to really dive into that too much. But then, more movies like Firestarter, Children of the Corn, The Terminator, and yes, the very first Terminator, the original, actually is a horror movie. Now, as you move it to some of those other sequels, T2 and so on and so forth, it's more of like that sci-fi action-y thriller type, but there are a good amount of horror elements in the original Terminator, so that is for sure going to make the list. And so then we hit the halfway point and we're at 1985. And with 1985, We have a little bit more Romero, so we have a movie like Day of the Dead, which is a movie that I really enjoy. Then you have the amazing Fright Night. I love Fright Night. I love Chris Sarandon. I've mentioned this before, I love vampires, so that movie is great and it's a classic. You have Return of the Living Dead, which is more of a comedic version of, you know, all of the Dead movies. You have Tom Matthews in that, Linnea Quigley. That movie is chock full of people that you've probably seen before, so that one's a cool movie to watch for sure. You have a movie like Nightmare on Elm Street 2, once again back with the horror slasher sequels. Gets a bad rap, but I think overall it's a very solid movie. Or just a couple of things that they could have tweaked that would have made it a better movie, and it would have been more consistent with, you know, the lore and the things that we know of Freddy from the original movie. But outside of that, very solid movie. So 85 was looking really sharp, and then we roll into 86. Movies like Chopping Mall, you have Night of the Creeps, The Fly. All of these movies I'm not really just the biggest fan of, but also I do respect, you know, but I do respect their place in the horror genre. But it kind of still goes back to too much regurgitation of the same stuff that we've already seen before, you know. And then rolling into 87, you have like Evil Dead 2, kinda similarly to Nightmare on Elm Street 2 in comparison to the original, where there was a little bit of a tone change. So in the original Evil Dead, it was a little more on the serious side, and then with Evil Dead 2, there's a little more comedic elements and you know, funny moments. You know, just overall, just a less serious tone together. But in a lot of cases, a lot of people think that Evil Dead 2 is better than Evil Dead 1. But then, you know, you get the original Hellraiser in this year. Hellraiser is very solid, and we all know the iconic Pinhead. The Lost Boys, love The Lost Boys. And another movie that I love, which is also a sequel that I just mentioned earlier, is Creepshow 2. Creepshow 2, in my opinion, when you think of like all the stories, and, you know, me talking about how there's like a central story that wraps around all the other little stories that they include in the movie, I think that Creepshow 2 basically is a better version of every single aspect of Creepshow 1. Now, there are some people that are going to differ, but to me, perfect. And so then that leads us to 1988. We are getting ready to hit the end of the decade, but we're still getting some pretty decent movies here and there. And have movies like Halloween 4, once again, another sequel, Halloween 4. The biggest thing that I love about Halloween 4 is just the feeling and the atmosphere that it gives to that movie, just to start out a movie. And then you think about all of the events that happened prior to this movie, and how empty looking, and just these wide pan shots. It's just beautiful. I love everything about it. Then Child's Play is also a movie that I absolutely adore. Brad Dourif as Charles Lee Ray / Chucky is probably one of the most iconic and recognizable voices in horror altogether. Everybody knows him, so there ain't even too much more to talk about, but he's a legend. And there's a movie like They Live that also came out in 88. And then we move on into 1989, and we have movies like Puppet Master, which was really good. Pet Sematary, which I also think is very good. I'm a big fan of Pet Sematary, but once again, talking about a Stephen King adaptation, you know. And then you have movies like Sleepaway Camp 3, which I still also do enjoy. It's just fun slashery horror. Friday the 13th Part 8. I don't even need to say anything else about that. And Halloween 5, the same thing. At this point, with this many sequels, you can tell that, you know, a lot of the quality in some of the slashers was starting to really decrease it. And this is not even including a lot of those movies that tried to emulate a lot of our favorite slashers. So the Halloweens and the Friday the 13th and stuff like that. Some of them didn't do it all that well. Some did them well, like The Burning, and some didn't do it so well. But still, regardless, even though they're not some of the best movies, I'm still happy that we got them, because overall, you're still gonna have that 80s aesthetic. And considering I love the 80s aesthetic, some of it I'm cool with bypassing. But that's all I got for y'all, Spooky Gang. Let me know what you think of the 80s decade. It was an amazing decade for horror. I would say the majority of the horror movies were good. almost a golden era for horror. I don't know, I just love pretty much everything about it. So yeah, like I said, y'all comment down below what you think of the 80s as far as horror movies, and what is your favorite horror movie of the 1980s. Y'all subscribe, like the video, share it with your friends, anybody that's a horror lover. And if you know you rocking with tech, then go ahead, share it out so we could go ahead continue to grow this channel, and so the Spooky Gang could take over the tube. So until next time, most importantly, y'all stay blessed, and Spooky Gang, y'all stay spooky.